Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining the talk. Great to see you all have an interest in local history. And totally surprised that you're not sitting in a beer garden having a drink at the moment. So well done for that. Although there will still be time later on. I think that could be well where I end up a little bit later. So I'm going to share my screen now and run through the presentation. Okay, so this should last for about an hour, so make sure you're sitting comfortably. So yes, the barbarous murder of Wigan Lane. This story actually takes place or starts in 1840, which was a period of great change. The sort of Georgian era had come to an end, and the Victorian era was just starting. Very young 18-year-old Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1838, and she married Albert Saxe-Coburg Gotha early in 1940, and that's when our story starts. But let me start by showing you a couple of pictures that I think illustrate the pace of change around that time. So a lot of you will may have seen this picture already, the parish church of Wigan in the town centre. So this was published in 1836 in Bain's History of Lancashire, although it was painted or drawn much earlier than that. But this is in the town centre, and you can see it's a semi-rural setting. You can see there are cows and sheep grazing in the field. So contrast that with an engraving I found from the 1840s. So things look very different. It's taken from a similar angle, but just a bit further away. So hopefully you can still see the parish church there underneath the or through the arch of the bridge. But you can see now railways and steam power have arrived, and they will turbocharge the Industrial Revolution, which will take off at some pace, from 1840 onwards. So you can see, although the locomotives are still quite primitive at this stage. So this railway running across the top is the Northern Union Railway, which was extended from Wigan to Preston in 1838. The railway running underneath the bridge is the Liverpool-Bury line, belonged to the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, and that would open in 1848. So, but you can see it's still under construction. You can see, hopefully you can see these chaps carving blocks of stone from this huge piece of stone here, and these blocks being carted into place to complete the bridge parapet. So this bridge is actually still in place. It's the first bridge that you go under when you leave Walgate Station heading for either Liverpool or Southport. And this is what it looks like after, being blackened by 100 years of industry. So that was just to set the scene. But our real story starts here. Another parish church. This is St. Wilfrid's in Standish. Beautiful Grade 1 listed building. Main body of the church was built in the 1580s, although we know there's been a church here since 1205. In fact, St. Wilfrid's has got what's known as a circumlinear churchyard, which means that it was probably a site of worship and a site of burial from pre-Christian days. Now, I took this photo standing next to a particular grave, and it's this grave, the grave of the Coulson family. And I noticed this while walking through the churchyard a couple of years ago now, and it stood out because of the amount of writing on the gravestone. And as I started to sort of scan down and read it, a couple of words jumped out: barbarously murdered. Now, these aren't words that you normally expect to see in a peaceful churchyard. So I was intrigued, took more photographs, and came home to try and research more, find out, what happened to, in particular, it was a chap called John Coulson. So most of the inscription on the stone related to him. Just excuse me, I'll have to adjust my view because the some of the of the pictures were in the way of the text. So this is what the stone said about John Coulson. Sacred to the memory of John Coulson, late underlooker to the Right Honourable the Earl of Balcarres, steady and faithful servant who was robbed and barbarously murdered in this township on the 25th day of July 1840, whilst on his way from Wigan to his residence in Hay. He was a man deservedly respected by all who knew him, aged 38 years. So I thought, wow, you know, there's a story here just on the gravestone alone. I could see that there were 2 more entries on the gravestone, and that the family had already known tragedy. John's younger brother Thomas, who was also a collier, he died 3 years earlier at the age of 24. And I found out that he'd actually died in an accident at Aberdeen Colliery. He fell down the shaft from a basket. This is a picture of miners going down Douglas Bank Colliery much later in the Victorian era, and this basket or cage doesn't look too safe. You can imagine 50 or 60 years earlier, they were a lot less safe. John's father was also buried in the grave, and he sadly must have watched 2 of his sons, you know, die in tragic circumstances. But you know, the grave also records that he was the faithful servant of the Earl of Balcarres at Hay Collieries. So I discovered then that John actually lived in Red Rock Bridge. Newspapers reported that he was highly thought of by the Earl of Crawford and lived in a house purposely built for him by his employer. I think that was just newspaper talk for saying, you know, that he lived in a miner's cottage. John worked in the Hay Collieries nearby, and there were quite a few of them around the Red Rock area. And he actually worked in Button Pit as well, which, as many of you will know, was the scene of a notorious murder some years later in 1863. In fact, I found out through Claire Kenyon that James Barton, the Button Pit victim, had actually worked with John Coulson. So 2 men, you know, worked together and knew each other, and they were both victims of a murder. So this is Red Rock in the 1840s. So you can see the canal running through. So the canal was a bit like the M6 in those days, you know, busy with coal barges coming and going. Of course, it was known as the Lancaster Canal in those days. But you can see over here, Arley Colliery, with the tram road leading down to the canal. Down here, Bork Pit, otherwise known as Button Pit, again with a tram road leading down to the colliery. Across here, Worthington Paper Mill, would later become the bleaching and dyeing works. And that was working flat out to produce paper for meet the growing demand for the printed word. And there were 4 rows of workers' cottages in the area, and John actually lived at this one, Red Rock Row, which would later be demolished to make way for the Lancashire Union Railway. In fact, it had become the location of Red Rock Station. And the other 3 rows, Top Row, Middle Row, Cut Row, the only one that's left today is Middle Row, which is known now as Canal Row. So John and his extended family all lived and worked in this area. The only photograph from the 1800s of the area is this one that I could find. So this is Worthington Mill here. You can see the smoke bellowing out of the chimney. We can date this photograph to around 1890 because Mayflower cottages here, you'll see, are still under construction. And you can just see on the horizon there the telltale sort of trademark of Button Pit, the 3 chimneys in a row. And you can see that this is very much from a different time. You can see the women are dressed in full-length dresses, wearing bonnets out, you know, harvesting the corn. So what happened to John? How did he become the victim of a barbarous murder? Well, by piecing together information from all the legal proceedings that followed, we're able to tell his story. So John worked hard down the mines during the week. At weekends, he liked to go out and enjoy himself. So on one July Saturday morning, he headed out on his horse. Initially went over Red Rock Bridge and headed across to see some friends in Bolton. Later in the afternoon, then he came across to Wigan, and he stabled his horse in the Crofters Arms. This is a drawing of Hallgate from 1840. This is the Crofters Arms. Still there in the same place today, although this street is now, of course, known as Market Street. At that time, it was known as Hallgate. It sort of zigzagged its way down to the rectory at the bottom. So many pubs in those days, wood stable horses. If you look at the old census returns, you'll see many pubs had ostlers living in them, and they were the people employed specifically to look after the horses. If you look at the old maps, you'll see there was a Crofters Yard behind the Crofters Pub, which led down to the pig market a little bit further down. So John didn't come back for his horse until around midnight. So he'd spent the whole afternoon and evening, drinking with friends. So he'd arranged to meet his sister-in-law, a woman called Ellen France, in the Queen's Head at midnight or around about midnight. And they'd planned to travel home together. Ellen lived up in Arley as well. So this is the Queen's Head. Used to be in Marketplace. It was demolished to make way for Library Street at the turn of the 20th century. But when Ellen got to the pub, John had already gone. She apparently stayed and had a few more drinks and was there till about 1 o'clock in the morning. But John had headed off up Standish Gate and up Wigan Lane. He was seen stopping off, though, at Mab's Cross in the Golden Cross pub. So I don't know if you can see the picture there. That's the Golden Cross just on the left. And you can see Mab's Cross used to be just outside the pub before it was later moved to the other side of the road. So witnesses saw John coming out of the pub. He still had his horse, of course, and they, described him as being a little bit tipsy, which is hardly surprising. So John eventually makes his way to the toll gate on Wigan Lane. So at this time, he had to pay a toll. It was run by the Wigan and Preston Turnpike Trust. There was another gate at the other end of Standish at Langtree Bar, which is what gave Langtree Bar its name. So John has to stop. He has to pay the toll, penny halfpenny to take a horse through. You can pass through the gate on foot free of charge. If you've got a carriage or a wagon, there's a sliding scale. So the toll gate was run by a chap called Richard Roberts, but it was gone midnight, and Richard wanted to stay indoors, sent his wife out to look after John. So Anne Roberts came out to see him. She reported later on that he was quite drunk. In fact, she gave him a crown, which was about 40 times as much as he needed to pay. She said she thought it was a penny and asked him for another halfpenny, although she was at lengths to say that she didn't take advantage of him in his condition and made sure that, she gave him the right change in the end. But I guess, we would have to take her word for that. So Anne went back indoors, let John through the gate, reported later on that she heard a loud bang, but she said she thought nothing of it because Hay Foundry and Brockmill Forge were nearby, and they quite often worked during the night. So John continued on his way past the boundary stone that many of you will know on Wigan Lane. That's what it looks like today. It was renewed in 1904. So he's now left Wigan Township and he's in Standish with Langtree Township. He gets about another 120 yards on beyond the boundary stone when suddenly he's set upon, reportedly by 3 men. So John's a big lad, over 6 foot, spent his life down pits. He's had a few drinks. He decides to fight back. Suddenly there's a loud bang. John's been shot in the head at close range. His horse gallops off, is found in Standish the following morning. So his attacker's rifle through his pockets. John's left at the side of the road in a pool of blood. So you'd think Wigan Lane would be quiet at this, it's the middle of the night by now, but there were quite a few people coming and going who came forward as witnesses later on. A number of people saw John lying by the road, but thought he was asleep drunk and just left him to it. Eventually, around about 5 o'clock, somebody actually stopped to see if he was okay. Incredibly, John was still alive. But he was surrounded by a pool of blood, and there was still blood coming from the wound under his ear. And somehow he'd managed to prop himself up on his knees and his elbows. The witness described him as being insensible, and apparently he said something like, "Where am I? They've taken my money." So anyway, the chap runs on ahead to the Boar's Head Inn. which is about another 150, 200 yards away, gets help to try and carry John back there. So John's carried into the Boar's Head. He's laid out on the table, and they send for the local surgeon, George Dalgleish, who's got a practice at 35 Standish Gate. You recognise that name, possibly Dalgleish. He was the son of Robert, the well-known steam pioneer based at Hay Forge. So George himself later became an alderman and a magistrate, and he was actually involved in the Button Pit murder as well as, in a professional capacity. So he could see that John had been shot. He said he still had the slugs in him, as he put it, and he ordered him to be taken home on a shandry. He visited him in the next few days at his home in Red Rock. But he said that John reported that he had great pain in his head, and he died the following Wednesday evening. So for those of you who don't know the area, this is the sort of crime scene. This is Wigan Lane, running up from Wigan through to Standish. This is the mini roundabout of the Boar's Head, where the Chorley Road forks off. So the toll gate used to be just here where the reservoir is, near where there are bus stops now on either side of the road. The boundary stone a little bit further on about here, and then John was attacked just about here, opposite what's now Mere Oaks housing development. And then he was carried to the Boar's Head just here, near the mini roundabout. So the murder hunt began. An initial award of £20 was offered. It was increased to 50, and the Earl matched it with another 50. So a reward of £100, which was a huge amount of money in 1840. Inquest was held. It found that John had been murdered for a pocket watch, a handkerchief, and whatever cash he had left after his night out. So John had nothing left in his pockets, it was said, other than a piece of bread. So very quickly, the police arrested 3 suspects, and they were congratulated on their quick actions. They'd arrested 3 navvies or navigators called Swift, Sharrocks and Almond. They were working on constructing the railway up near Chorley. Now, you all know that navvies, played a vital part in the Industrial Revolution. They built the canals, railways and roads. But they were generally made to feel unwelcome. They would set up shanty towns, camps, or sleep rough, near where they were working. And if there was any crime was committed in the area and navvies were around, well, then they usually got the blame. So these particular navvies had been working on the Bolton to Preston Railway, which was being built up near Chorley. It had reached Rawlinson Bridge by this time. So they were arrested and questioned in front of the magistrates. Plenty of witnesses were found by the police who would come forward to to incriminate them. So the story that emerged was that they'd been up to Chorley to collect their wages. They'd been drinking in the Duke of York pub. And you can see that that pub's still there, just on the left-hand side on the A6 as you enter Chorley. Obviously, it's been rebuilt a couple of times since 1840. It didn't look like that then. It certainly didn't have Sky Sports in those days. So the landlord, Thomas Whitnell, came forward to say that the navvies had been drinking here until about 11:30. Then they'd asked if they could sleep in his hayloft. But he refused. He said there were already two men in there, and anyway, he didn't want their sort. So they went along the canal to Rawlinson Bridge, close to where they'd been working. They'd made friends with a boatman there, John Atherton, and they asked if they could sleep in the cabin of his boat, and he agreed. But he later came forward as a witness and said, they were behaving suspiciously. They were very nervous and restless. They left at first light before anybody could see them. So this is Rawlinson Bridge today, beautiful spot on the canal. Ellerbeck Marina is just there. This row of cottages was actually there at the time. In fact, one of these cottages was a beer house. But I think dawn was probably even a little bit early for the navvies to have a drink. So apparently they stayed on the canal, walked up to Red Rock, came off at Red Rock Bridge, and went across to John Watmo's beer house, now known as Douglas House. So it was 6 a.m. and obviously, it was now late enough in the day for them to have a drink or two. So I discovered when I researched this story that you could get a drink pretty much any time, night or day. At this time, the sort of licensing laws and opening hours that that we all know now didn't exist then, and it was you could literally buy a drink or get a drink, at almost any hour of the day or night. So anyway, they went on to the Boar's Head, and they suspiciously arrived there just as John Coulson was being laid out on the table. Two servants from the Boar's Head came forward, and they said the navvies entered the room where John was laid out, but they didn't ask what had happened to him, implying that, well, they must have known. They also reported that they were seen with a watch and chain and plenty of money, but of course they had just been paid. So the police kept them in custody, said they had more witnesses to come forward, more conclusive witnesses, and they believed they were building a strong case against the navvies. Then suddenly a new development. There's completely new suspects. The navvies, as it happens, are actually completely innocent and are released without charge. And they must have felt a bit like this chap, the Halsall navvy, which is a good heroic representation of navvies that's on the bank of the canal of Halsall, near to where construction of the canal first started. But it does make you wonder what would have happened to the navvies if these new suspects hadn't been found. So who were the new suspects? Well, the police had arrested a criminal gang from Manchester who were operating in the Wigan area. And allegedly, when they were arrested, the two ringleaders thought they were being arrested for the Coulson murder, and they immediately started to try and incriminate each other. And that was the story the police told. One of the suspects, Robert Anderton, was actually from the Wigan area. He was actually from Adlington Common. And it turned out later on, it was revealed later that he actually knew John Coulson. They'd grown up in the same area. But at this point in time, Anderton was living in Eckroyd Street. I don't know if you can see that on the map, but there's Eckroyd Street. This is the area behind Piccadilly Station. In those days, it was known as London Road Station. This Fairfield Street is still there. It's the street that runs under all the lines that come in to Piccadilly. If you ever use the multi-storey car park at Piccadilly, if you can afford it, that's you usually drive out along Fairfield Street. So when they raided the cellar where Anderton lived in Eckroyd Street, they allegedly found blood-speckled clothing, a handkerchief like the one had been stolen from John Coulson, and a clutch of pawn tickets. So this area of Manchester was very deprived, lots of people living in cellars, lots of large families living in single rooms. You can see this is the River Medlock sort of running through. And this area actually here is under archaeological investigation at the moment ahead of the Mayfield development. And I think they have actually excavated some of these old, slum dwellings and cellars. And you may have seen in the news they recently unearthed a virtually intact Victorian swimming pool from the old Victorian baths that used to be there. So Manchester at this time was known as Crime City. This is an interesting book by Joe O'Neill, a local historian from West Horton. I joined a talk that Joe gave a couple of weeks ago. But he was, explaining how the dreadful social conditions of the time created this criminal underclass. And he pointed out that life expectancy in England in 1840 was only 40 years, half what it is now. But in Manchester, it was 24. And in Ancoats, one of the most deprived areas, it was just 20. So this criminal underclass, engaged obviously in activity to, achieve money, in whatever way they could possibly do that. They were known locally as scuttlers. and they worked quite often around London Road Station, as it was known then, Piccadilly as we know it now. And they would, steal anything they could from the people passing through. And this criminal activity was supported by a network of pawn shops, because pawn shops allowed people to basically convert anything into money. I know we call them cash converters now, but that's exactly what they were then. And Joe, explained that he could pawn just about anything. And the most extreme example he came across was somebody who pawned a cup of lard, which I guess indicates how desperate they were. I'm not sure what you would get for a cup of lard, but it can't have been very much. So anyway, in the meantime, the suspects were being held in Wigan. A number of them were in the Bridewell on the corner of the Weed and Millgate, but that was full. And Anderton, the sort of ringleader, was being held in the New Town Hall in the courtroom, where he was also being questioned. And there was a metal bar that ran across the courtroom to help detain prisoners, and he was chained to that with leg irons. He had handcuffs on, and he was under the watchful eye of 2 constables. So this is the New Town Hall, as it was known. Doesn't look very new. It was called the New Town Hall because it replaced the Moot Hall, as I'm sure many of you will know. It was built on pillars, and this area underneath was known as the Shambles, and it was mainly occupied by butchers and meat stalls. You can actually see some of the meat on display. So yes, I think this was probably taken not long before it was demolished in 1882. So incredibly, at 2 a.m. in the morning, Anderton escapes. Somehow he removes the handcuffs. He cuts through one of the leg irons. He climbs out of the window onto the balcony, and then lowers himself down with the help of a rope past one of the butcher's shops. He makes off down Hallgate. A night watchman and someone else who's out with him spot him, chase after him, but he's too quick for them, and he loses them by the time they get to the Rectory Gate at the bottom of Hallgate. So how could this possibly happen? He was meant to be under the watchful eye of 2 constables. Well, attention focuses then on those 2 constables and a chap called Knowles in particular, and he's arrested. And it emerges through questioning that he'd insisted that Anderton wear his handcuffs because he thought the others were ill-fitting. And it turns out that he's been seen drinking with some of the criminal gang or some of their associates in the Fleece pub. And he's also sharing lodgings with some of the criminal fraternity. So he's suspected of giving Anderson a tool to cut through his leg irons, providing the rope for him to scale down from the balcony with, and generally, helping with his escape. And the newspapers reported the following day, criticising what they call the Tory members of the Watch Committee. Watch Committee was the forerunner of the police authority, which I guess must have had a Conservative majority at the time. But apparently they'd dismissed another constable to give Knowles the job. So clearly a little bit of corruption there in high places. Knowles was released pending further investigation, but can't find any evidence or any record of him being prosecuted for, helping Anderton escape. So it may be that it was all swept under the carpet. So anyway, Anderton is on the loose, and he manages to evade capture for 6 days, but eventually he's cornered and captured in a barn in Orrell. So he's back in custody, him and Elijah Rowe, sent off to Kirkdale Jail in Liverpool. At one time, Lancaster is where the county assizes, county jail, and any subsequent executions took place. But as the population of Liverpool and Manchester expanded and the crime rate grew, another county jail and another assizes court was set up in Liverpool to deal with the southern half of Lancashire. So they were in Kirkdale waiting to appear before the spring assizes. This is another photograph of later photographs of Kirkdale Jail. It's been demolished now, and there's a park on the site. But this is where people who were given the death sentence were brought back to be executed. So there were many people executed here over the years. In fact, Thomas Grimes, who was the found guilty of the Button Pit murder, would be executed here in 1866. So then another development, Elijah Rowe dies in prison in Kirkdale Jail. This is a newspaper report from Boxing Day, 1840. It says he has been almost from the very first day of his imprisonment gradually wasting away in a consumption. So Rowe has died of TB in prison, and this is potentially good news for Anderson because they were blaming each other for John Coulson's murder, and of course Rowe would no longer be alive to contradict Anderson's version of events. So anyway, 31st of March 1841, the trial begins in the Liverpool Sessions House. It's on the corner of Rumford Street and Chapel Street in Liverpool, as you'll see near the waterfront. For those of you who know Liverpool waterfront, this is where the Liver buildings would be built in 1911. St. Nicholas Church, you might recognise, it's still there, the Mariners' Church it's known as. So the Spring Assizes were quite an event. The judges would arrive in town. Sometimes they'd actually enter in a procession. All of the legal representatives, the witnesses, the press, the onlookers would all turn up, and all need accommodation. So it was, quite an event. And certainly up in Lancaster in the old days, if sometimes, it could be followed by a public execution. So the Session House was a temporary measure. New county courthouses were being built in this splendid building, St. George's Hall in Liverpool, and the courtrooms were being built at sort of this end of it, but they wouldn't be ready till 1851. This is what one of those courtrooms looks like today. So, really impressive, very daunting if you can imagine coming up from the cells below into the dock, being faced with this room, packed with people. So the County Sessions House was a little bit more modest. Like I say, this was being used temporarily while St. George's Hall was being built. So you can see this is Chapel Street leading down to the river. You can see the ship's mast at the bottom there, and this is St. Nicholas's Church. So Justice Maule had been appointed to hear the case, and barristers had been appointed for the defence, for the prosecution. Jury had been sworn in those days, obviously an all-male jury, drawn from the middle class or the sort of merchant class across Manchester and Merseyside. So I found this this picture of a jury painted by John Morgan. So this is an early Victorian jury. They don't look particularly sort of interested in what's going on, do they? But hopefully the jury in this case showed a little bit more interest. So the trial begins. The prosecution call over 30 witnesses, includes John Coulson's 9-year-old daughter. And she's asked to give a description of his watch, and she talks about how she held it in her hand and played with it on the very morning that he left. They bring across Mr. Tarbock, who was the man who had lent John Coulson the watch. He hadn't actually bought the watch; he had it on trial, which I guess was a thing if you couldn't afford to buy one outright. The pawnbroker from Bolton was brought across, who gave a statement to say Anderson had pawned the watch, John Coulson's watch, with him 2 days after the murder, using the name of Robert Crook, which sounds like a Mickey take, but apparently that was his mother's maiden name. And he was given 7 shillings for the watch, which a lot of money in those days. Anne Roberts, the toll gatekeeper, she's brought across to give her evidence. And then George Dalgleish, the surgeon, takes the stand. And he describes how he removed a piece of bullet from John Coulton's head, weighing 32 grains, which is the modern equivalent of a couple of grams. And he describes how after he died, he opened the head, removed a larger, deeper piece that weighed 95 grains. And he explained that the bullet had shattered the bone in John's head, which had caused the hemorrhage, which was, the obvious cause of death. He also explained that the shot had been fired from a flintlock pistol. This is what a flintlock pistol looked like in 1840. So the point being made was that, it must have been premeditated. So this is a flintlock pistol. The flint was held in this sort of hammer here, and when you pulled the trigger, it hit this serrated metal plate, generated a spark that ignited the flash pan, as it was known, ignited gunpowder, which fired the bullet. But it takes some time to prime and load one of these, so you would have to go out with it loaded and hidden in your coat with the intention of using it, not something that you could just use on the spur of the moment. So more witnesses were called. John McMaster, the draper from Standish Gate, who'd sold John Coulton the handkerchief for 5 shillings and 6pence. Handkerchiefs were quite valuable items in those days, which is why they were quite often the subject of pickpockets. A woman who lived next door to Anderton in the cellar in Eckroyd Street came forward to say that his wife had passed through a box containing gunpowder and bullet moulds to conceal. And then they called Jane Roberts, Anderton's partner. She lived with him as his wife, and many people believed she was his wife, but they weren't actually married. So she's expected to be a key witness for the prosecution because she's given statements to the police to say that Anderton had pawn tickets, that he had a watch, that he had a pistol and bullet making equipment. But when she's called, she actually refuses to take the oath. She says, "I will not be sworn as I know nothing whatever." The judge patiently explains, that doesn't matter, you still need to take the oath. But she says, "I don't know anything." Judge directs the crier to administer the oath, but she refuses. So the judge loses his patience and orders her to be taken into custody for contempt. A few more witnesses are heard, and then the judge brings Jane Roberts back because her testimony is crucial, and he wants to try and extract it from her. So the judge says, "Take the book and be sworn instantly," but again she refuses. "I give you warning that if you do not take the book and be sworn, you will be punished severely." The prosecution weighs in. "Do take the book, woman." Even Anderton himself now asks for permission to speak and tells her, "All the blame lies on me and other people. Please speak." And she just remains silent. The judge, "I'll waste no more time about this. Do you refuse to answer? Will you tell me if you will be sworn or not?" "I will not be sworn," she says. At this point, Anderton, a hardened criminal, actually, his emotions get the better of him and he bursts into a flood of tears. I guess seeing this woman stand up for him, and refuse to give evidence against him out of, love or loyalty, at the risk of, a jail sentence is too much for his emotions. The judge, eventually using her first name, "Well, Jane, as you refuse to be sworn, the court has recorded your refusal and you are committed to 12 calendar months in prison." Then more witnesses are heard and the summing up begins, and the judge is handed a note, and the note says Jane Roberts now wants to give evidence. So she's brought back into the witness box for a third time. She's sworn in. But she doesn't give the evidence that is expected. And she says, "What I swore before the magistrates was false. I live in the same cellar as Robert. I've seen no pistol in the cellar. I had not sworn this to the magistrates. I had not seen any bullet or bullet mold there, and had never said anything of the sort." So not only is she not supported the prosecution, but she's actually, done her best to undermine their case. So the judge orders her to be taken to prison for 6 months. So he appears to have shaved 6 months off, I guess, because she at least agreed to take the oath. So the summaries begin. The defence says Anderson is a bad man, but there's only circumstantial evidence against him. No human eye could have seen him apart from that of the murdered man. The judge tells the jury that some of the prosecution's evidence is weak, and asks them to focus on what they think they don't have any doubts about. So the jury retires, but within 35 minutes they're back. The foreman stands to give his verdict: not guilty. So Anderson is found not guilty of the murder of John Coulson. I suppose that's reassuring in one way, that the burden of proof in those days was high. But actually, nobody is ever found guilty of the murder of John Coulson. So the court rises at 6:30. Newspaper reports the following day that this trial lasted the whole day, implying that it was a lengthy trial. Of course, these days, a trial of this nature would last several weeks. But of course, Anderson doesn't go free because he's charged with theft and burglary. So a week later, he's back in the assizes in front of Judge Maul again. He's found guilty. And the judge tells him that he's lucky to have escaped the gallows. There was no doubt he had a big hand in the murder of Mr. Coulson. The sentence of the court is that he should be transported across the seas for the term of his natural life. And tells him he's been guilty of more crimes than would have furnished a calendar for the whole county. And if ever there was a notorious criminal who should be put away from society, he was the man. So Anderson was sentenced to a lifetime of transportation. Penal transportation was introduced for three main reasons. One was to help to support the colonies and support their growth. Another was to relieve overcrowded prisons. But another reason was because the death sentence was considered too severe for many of the sort of minor felonies that it was being given, until transportation was introduced. So it was a more palatable form of punishment. At one time, there were over 200 offences that you could be given the death sentence for. So yeah, from the early days of transportation, people were sent to America, but then when following the American independence in 1776, they put a stop to that. They no longer wanted to take British convicts for obvious reasons. Australia then became the main destination, and initially convicts were sent to New South Wales. So these are some of the crimes that you could be transported for. So at one time, these were capital offences. You could be hung for many of these. But yeah, some of them, fairly minor. Petty larceny, theft under 1 shilling. Clandestine marriage, assaulting, cutting or burning clothes. Impersonating an Egyptian is an interesting one. And I discovered that an Egyptian was in effect a gypsy. I think in the early days, he thought Romanese came from Egypt. So impersonating a gypsy, that means, I guess that means, behaving like a gypsy, I suppose, is the intention. So the first convicts sent to Australia arrived at Botany Bay in 1788. They soon moved further north to find a better natural harbour at Port Jackson, and that became the location for Sydney, which was named after the British Home Secretary at the time. And there was an issue with taking convicts to mainland Australia because there was an island the size of a continent for them to escape into. And there was this bizarre myth amongst prisoners that you can actually walk to China. So they thought they could walk. They believed it to be about 150 miles away, and if they got to China, they'd be free. So many prisoners tried to escape, Of course, they didn't get very far, and their sort of remains were usually found in the outback sometime later. Didn't help the fact that there was a major mountain range in the way that ran up the eastern side of Australia. Some did escape and did survive, and they were known as bush rangers. The most notorious bush ranger, and one of the last bush rangers, was Ned Kelly. Ned wasn't actually a convict, but he was the son of a convict. His father died when he was 13, and he formed an outlaw gang and generally wreaked havoc. So this on the right isn't actually Ned, it's a policeman wearing Ned's armour. In the last, he became sort of a bit of a folk legend. In the last gun battle with the police, he and his gang dressed in makeshift armour made from old parts from old farm machinery. And as they were fired upon by the police, they just kept walking towards the police and returning fire. They were hit a few times, which stopped them in their tracks. Eventually, most of the gang were killed, and a policeman managed to hit Kelly in the thigh with a shotgun, with a pellets from a shotgun, which brought him down. He survived and was tried and executed later on, but he was he actually had popular support as a figure, because he was seen as representing the downtrodden of Australia. So there were big mass protests when he was executed. The reason I wanted to show you Ned is because of this chap here on the left. So this isn't Ned, although Ned did have a beard as well. This chap on the left is actually Frederick Standish, from Standish Hall, who's connected to this story, born about a mile from where I'm sitting. He was the second son of Charles Strickland Standish, and he had a bit of a checkered life. He liked horse racing, and he was said to be fond of the sideboard, which I think was a euphemism for meaning that he liked to help himself to a drink. So it's a long story anyway, but he ended up as the police commissioner for the state of Victoria in Australia. And he played a part in the downfall of Ned Kelly. He deployed a team of Aboriginal bush trackers to track Kelly down. So this is Frederick Standish here on the right. This is the team of bush trackers. So they helped to successfully track down and ultimately capture Ned Kelly. Frederick, his love of racing led him to be a prominent figure in the Australian Jockey Club, and he was credited with founding the Melbourne Cup, which is the Australian equivalent of the Derby. One of the richest races in the world. So he has a position in in Australian history, even though he was born within the borough, as they say. So Van Diemen's Land became the destination for convicts. It had the advantage of being an island. Van Diemen's Land, when I was younger, I used to think it meant the land of demons, but it was actually named after Anthony Van Diemen. He was the Governor General of the Dutch East Indies at the time, which modern day Indonesia. And an explorer called Abel Tasman named it after him. He worked for the Dutch East India Company, and he was clever enough to name the island after his boss. It became a British colony later in 1803. And then when it became an independent self-governing colony in 1856, it was renamed Tasmania. I think by this time, Van Diemen's Land, had a reputation connected with convicts and transportation, and which is probably why they changed the name. And of course, we talk about Tasmania being discovered, but of course, Aborigines had lived there for 30,000 years, and they knew it as Lutruwita. And obviously the arrival of European settlers was bad news for them. The eventually lost most of their land and at one time were squeezed into a small corner of the island. Transportation to Australia continued to around about 1850, although it wasn't finally abolished till 1867. By that time, over 160,000 convicts had been transported. So what happened to Anderton? Well, he was initially sent down to a prison hulk in the Thames estuary, which is where prisoners were kept until they could be shipped out. They were taken on shore during the day to do hard labour, which included dredging the Thames. But eventually, in August 1841, he was put on board the Barbarous and shipped across to Hobart. Along with 350 other male prisoners. They arrived 5 months later. Only 3 convicts died en route, which wasn't a bad outcome. In the early days of transportation, as many as a third of convicts could die en route. In fact, they started fining ships' captains up to £40 for each prisoner that died to try and solve the problem. So this is a picture of a prison ship, the Success, which survived long enough to be photographed. This is it in Hobart Harbour. This is a picture of it out of the water being repaired. So you see the scale of these ships, and they had to sustain 350, 400 people for 5 months. So, they were significant vessels. You might be able to see there the sort of arrows on the hull, which indicate that it was a prison ship. It was originally built as a Royal Navy ship in Liverpool in 1781, but it became a prison ship in 1814. So this is where Anderton was heading, Port Arthur. It was described as a machine to grind rogues honest. So this was the sort of notorious penitentiary where the worst criminals were taken. It closed in 1877 and it was later gutted by bushfires in the 1890s. And for about 35 years now, archaeologists and conservationists have been working to sort of preserve it and interpret it. It's become a major visitors attraction. It's actually now got UNESCO World Heritage status in recognition of its important part in Australian history. I actually came across an old silent movie from 1927 that depicted life in Port Arthur. It was called For the Term of His Natural Life. It was based on a novel. And it does, depict what life was like at the time. In fact, it reshaped Australia's view of transportation and convict treatment, and it even became a major tourist attraction in the 1920s. It's about a fairly well-off Englishman who's wrongly convicted of the manslaughter of his uncle and sent gets lifetime transportation. So let's just watch a little bit of it. So the protagonist is someone called Dawes. So you can see this is, the penitentiary. And you can see these are convicts undergoing daily hard labour. And here's Dawes arriving off the ship, having his leg irons removed, being taunted by the guard, letting him know what's in store for him. So yeah, this is routine hard labour. I don't know if you can work out what's happening there, but these men are being used to pull ploughs to plough the fields. So back-breaking work. I guess if it's your lucky day, you get to walk behind the plough. But that was there were other forms of hard labour, but that was a fairly common one. If you actually committed an offence or transgressed, you could be given hard labour in chains. So you would have to carry out that kind of work, but with heavy chains around your arms and legs. This is a sort of extreme example of convicts in chains. Hasten to add, these aren't from Australia, but that's an example of convicts having to wear heavy chains. I doubt if you could actually stand up with those on, let alone carry out hard labour. Another form of punishment, the most feared form of punishment, was flogging. And the movie depicts a prisoner being assigned to flog another prisoner, which did actually happen, as an attempt to break the bonds between convicts. The reality is, although, the film depicts this really harsh regime, the reality is that most prisoners, just kept their heads down and got on with it. But if they did step out of line, then the punishment was severe. So in this scene, Dawes has been ordered to flog, a young prisoner who's committed an offence. So I don't know about you, but these black and white movies have this sort of, have a realism about them. You start to believe that they were actually, filmed at the time. Of course, this movie was made, around 50 years after Port Arthur has closed. So this is Dawes here being ordered to, administer a flogging to an unfortunate young prisoner. And you see he can't bring himself to do it, but of course the punishment was administered by somebody else. Another form of punishment was solitary confinement. So prisoners locked up for up to 23 hours a day. When they were let out, they had to cover their faces because they weren't even allowed to have any form of sort of non-verbal communication. Now, the Victorians didn't do this to sort of mentally break convicts, although it did quite often have that effect. They believed that separating them and leaving them alone with their own thoughts, would help them repent, and reform. This picture on the left is in Pentonville prison. This is the chapel. And you can see that even in prayer, prisoners were kept in separate cubicles, and couldn't look at each other. So although it wasn't designed to break them, it's hardly surprising that Port Arthur had a purpose-built lunatic asylum on site, which is where many of the prisoners did actually end up. I came across this slightly surreal footage from the 1980s, a group of school children at Port Arthur going through this sort of immersive experience of solitary confinement. So just let's watch this. So I don't know if you could see that. Sorry, I don't know if you could hear that. I could hear the sound, but I think we had a few problems earlier on when we tested it out. But they were the actual cells, those children. Bit of a strange thing to, probably wouldn't put kids through that these days, but they were the actual solitary confinement cells that the children, came out of. They're still there today. You can still visit them and go and have a look around them. So anyway, what happened to Anderton when he was in Port Arthur? Thankfully, the Tasmanian State Archives have retained the convict records. So we're able to see in a single sheet you know, what happened to Anderton while he was there. So you can see there's quite a bit of detail in this. This is a detailed physical description running across the page. Later on, of course, they'd photograph prisoners to identify them, but at this time, you know, photography wasn't widely available. And then there's various records of incidents and things that happened to him while he was there. So from this, we can see that the year after he arrived, he was given 7 days in solitary confinement. So in those very cells that we've just seen those Australian children coming out of. That was for destroying a blanket, the property of the Crown. Same year, he was given a more severe sentence, 9 months hard labour in chains for destroying a bed tick. A bed tick is a form of mattress. He'd made it into a bag, a belt and a towel, and he also had bread in his possession, which clearly was an offence. He must have mended his ways, because in 1846 he was recorded as being allowed out to work for a Mr. Armitage in Baghdad, which was a town north of Hobart. In 1849 he was allowed out again to work for Mr. Longford. Mr. Jacobs in Longford, which was a town in central Tasmania. Then in 1857, at the age of 68, having served 15 years, he was offered a conditional pardon. So that meant he could have left, got a job, found somewhere to live, but what he wasn't allowed to do was to leave the colony. And he actually declined the pardon. There's no explanation as to why he declined it. You know, maybe that he was too old and institutionalized to think to try and set up on his own, or perhaps he'd repented and didn't think he deserved it. Anyway, 6 years later, at the age of 74, he died in Port Arthur, and the cause of death was recorded as mouth cancer. So our story is drawing to a close. Anderton is no more. As I said earlier, nobody was ever convicted of John Coulton's murder. Justice Small goes on to become a Privy Councillor and do well for himself. Jane Roberts, the loyal partner of Anderton, difficult to find out what happened to her. Jane Roberts is a very common name, but I did find a Jane Roberts who travelled on a free passage to New South Wales in 1843. So that could very well be Jane Roberts trying to follow Anderton to Australia. Women were offered free passages to try and redress the gender imbalance in the colony. It's not clear what happened to John Coulton's daughter, Margaret. I found her living with her grandfather in the 1841 census, but I'm not sure what happened to her after that. I also found that John had another brother, Edward, who did go on to have a family. In fact, he had an interesting life. He became a blacksmith in Aspel, emigrated to Canada, had 3 children in Canada, came back, ended up as a pub landlord in Toxteth in Liverpool. It's as if he was trying to, live a busy life on behalf of his 2 brothers. But I do know some of the family returned to the Wigan area. I've been trying to make contact through Ancestry, but so far haven't had any luck. So there our story would end. Or then again, there might be yet another footnote. So this picture is Red Rock Bridge, Bridge 63, which many of you will know, up on the canal. A bridge that many of the characters in this story will have crossed on a regular basis, and a good spot to go fishing. A friend of mine, Ron Wade, was pike fishing there with his son Adam in 2009. And it was starting to go dark. Adam felt something on the end of his line. He started to pull hard, and the rod was practically bent double. Carried on pulling and pulling harder. And then this came out of the canal. It looks very like a flintlock pistol, probably thrown in the bridge. Thrown in the canal from the bridge by somebody who wanted to get rid of it in a hurry. Probably somebody hoping that it would never be found. But incredibly, Adam caught it on the end of his fishing line and pulled it out of the canal. Ron was a bit worried about it. He wasn't sure whether it was a sawn-off shotgun. Asked Adam to take it to the police station, which he did. They've heard nothing about it since. So it's probably gone off to the police crusher. I mean, obviously, there's nothing to link this to the murder of John Coulton, but I think it does provide an interesting footnote. Thank you.